December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve in the frozen village of Gleize. On that icy morning, the battlefield looked more like a graveyard of steel. More than 100 German armored vehicles lay abandoned across the roads and fields around Gleize and the nearby villages. The massive 75-ton King Tigers sat like iron beasts frozen in place. The sleek Panthers, once feared across Europe, now pointed their long guns uselessly at the grey winter sky. Many of the vehicles were still armed and could have been used if fuel had been available, but several were damaged or had been abandoned because their crews ran out of supplies. Yet Hitler's elite 1st SS Panzer Division had climbed out, left everything behind, and disappeared into the snowy forest on foot. One of the obstacles that slowed the German tanks was a simple device called the daisy chain. Although the real reasons for the final collapse of Piper's column were the loss of fuel, blown bridges, and growing American pressure, a weapon worth only 50 cents, and the daisy chain was not part of the standard manuals, but soldiers had used similar improvised devices in earlier campaigns. The ones who created this miracle were the engineers of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, ordinary construction workers in uniform who used courage and quick thinking too. Their quick thinking played an important part in slowing Piper's advance and helping other American units contain the German attack. To understand why the daisy chain became necessary, you must first understand the environment that gave birth to it. December 1944 in the Ardennes forest was not merely cold. It was lethal. Temperatures hovered around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the breath of soldiers into clouds of ice crystals that hung in the still air. But the cold was only part of the nightmare. The ground itself had become an enemy. The ground had frozen so hard that digging a proper minefield became extremely difficult, and in many places almost impossible. This geological transformation terrified Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin and his men in the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion more than any German tank. Pergrin's men were not frontline killers. They were builders, the sons of carpenters and masons, men who had spent their lives constructing things rather than destroying them. Their war was usually fought with bulldozers and cranes, fixing bombed bridges and filling shell craters in roads. They were good at their jobs, and they took pride in keeping the army moving forward. But now, in mid-December 1944, intelligence reports brought them face to face with a threat that made their engineering skills seem utterly useless. Kampfgruppe Piper was coming. The name alone carried weight among Allied soldiers who had learned to respect and fear German armored formations. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper commanded this battle group, and his reputation preceded him like a dark storm. Young, ruthless, and fanatically devoted to speed, Piper led a column of tanks that reportedly stretched for miles along the frozen roads. His mission was brutally simple: cross the Meuse River within 24 hours and split the Allied armies in two. For Piper, fuel was blood and momentum was oxygen. If he stopped, if he lost his forward drive, Germany's last great offensive would die with him. Pergrin understood the standard military response to an advancing tank column. You laid a minefield. The doctrine was clear and had been proven in countless battles across Europe. Engineers would take M1A1 anti-tank mines, heavy steel discs packed with 6 pounds of TNT, and bury them in a checkerboard pattern across the road. You covered them with dirt, made the surface look undisturbed, and waited. When the tanks rolled over, the mines would detonate under the tracks or belly armor, crippling or destroying the vehicles. It was effective, proven, and reliable. But when the engineers of the 291st took their entrenching tools out to the roads near Stavelot, they discovered that nature had locked the door on conventional tactics. The first soldier to swing his shovel against the frozen earth heard a sound that would haunt the battalion, a sharp, metallic clang like a hammer striking an anvil. Sparks actually flew from the impact point where steel met frozen soil. The man tried again, putting his full weight behind the blow, and the shockwave travelled up the handle and rattled his bones. He had not even chipped away more than a fraction of an inch of ice-hard earth. Other men tried pickaxes, thinking the pointed steel might break through where shovels had failed. They raised the tools high and brought them down with all their strength. The points bounced off, leaving barely visible scratches in the frozen surface. Some men's hands went numb from the vibration. Others felt pain shooting up their arms into their shoulders. One engineer reportedly looked at his sergeant with desperation in his eyes and said something that captured the impossible situation they faced. "We can hear those engines getting louder. We've got crates full of high explosives, but we can't use them." The atmosphere among Peregrine's men grew heavy with the weight of their predicament. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with the wool of their uniforms created an odor that veterans would remember years later. These were men who had solved countless engineering problems across France and Belgium, but now they stood helpless, armed with weapons they could not deploy. If they left the mines on the surface of the road, German drivers would simply steer around them. If they tried to camouflage surface mines with snow, German combat engineers, the Panzer pioneers who walked ahead of tank columns, would spot them and kick them aside. The mines were useless unless buried, and the earth refused to accept them. In the distance, some men claimed they could already hear the distinctive sound of German Maybach engines, that high-pitched mechanical whine that was different from American motors. Whether they truly heard it or their fear created the sound in their imagination, the effect was the same. Time was running out. Somewhere out there in the frozen forest, 45-ton Panther tanks and 75-ton King Tigers were rolling toward them, and the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had no way to stop them. While American engineers struggled with frozen ground and mounting desperation, the German column advanced with what observers later described as a sense of invincibility. Joachim Peiper, at the head of Kampfgruppe Peiper, embodied the confidence of the German armoured forces in late 1944. He was young for his rank, his face still unlined, despite years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. Those who saw him during the Battle of the Bulge later recalled a man who seemed to regard obstacles as personal insults to be crushed through sheer willpower and speed. Peiper's confidence was not mere arrogance. It was built on a foundation of technological superiority that seemed unassailable. The King Tiger tanks in his column were among the heaviest in the world, and at about 70 tons they acted like moving fortresses with armor that was very difficult for most Allied weapons to penetrate. The Panthers, though lighter at 45 tons, mounted fearsome 75mm guns with superior optics that could identify and destroy enemy tanks at ranges where American crews could barely see their targets. Many of the soldiers in the column had combat experience, although a large number were younger troops who had joined the unit only recently and were not as seasoned as the older veterans. They had seen the worst the war could offer and had emerged hardened and skilled. Some German soldiers believed that American troops depended too much on artillery and air support, although many officers also recognized that US forces had become stronger and more capable by late 1944. This assessment, shared among officers and enlisted men alike, created a psychological advantage as powerful as any weapon. The German approach to mine warfare reflected this confidence in superior technique and technology. Ahead of Peiper's lead tanks walked the Panzer pioneers, combat engineers who carried responsibility for clearing the path. These men held mine detectors, sophisticated electronic devices that could sense the magnetic signature of buried metal. The procedure was methodical and proven. The pioneers would sweep their detectors across the road surface in overlapping patterns, watching the needles that would jump and flutter if metal lay beneath. When the detectors showed clear readings, the pioneers would signal back to the tank commanders. "Road clear, all ahead full." This system had worked throughout the war. The pioneers trusted their equipment, and the tank commanders trusted the pioneers. As Kampfgruppe Piper rolled through the Ardennes in those December days, the mine detection teams performed their duties with the confidence of men following a proven script. They walked past snow-covered ditches without concern, their attention focused on the road surface where doctrine and experience taught them to expect buried American mines. What they did not know, what no one in the German High Command could have anticipated, the American engineers used a daisy chain of mines, a method that had been known earlier in the war but was now used in a very difficult situation because the frozen ground made normal mine-laying impossible. The pioneers swept their detectors over roads and found nothing. They signaled all clear and moved forward. Behind them, concealed in the very ditches they had walked past, American soldiers watched and waited, their frozen fingers wrapped around lengths of rope that connected to mines the German equipment would never detect because those mines were not where the detectors searched. Some German officers believed that American units followed their manuals too closely, but the fighting in the Ardennes showed that U.S. troops could adapt when the situation demanded it. Somewhere in the American positions near Stavelot, perhaps in Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin's command tent, perhaps in a foxhole where cold soldiers huddled for warmth, someone asked a question that seemed almost absurdly simple. The historical record does not preserve the name of the man who first voiced it, but his words would echo through military history. The question was this: if we cannot hide the mine under the road, why don't we hide it beside the road? The first reaction among the engineers was likely skepticism. The idea sounded like something from a cartoon, a trap that Wile E. Coyote might set for the roadrunner. But desperate men are willing to examine even ridiculous ideas, and as the engineers thought through the logic, something remarkable emerged. A mine on the road was visible. The Germans would see it and avoid it. A mine in the ditch was invisible but useless. It could not reach the tanks. But a mine that could move, that could be dragged from its hiding place directly into the path of an oncoming tank at the critical moment, that might work. The engineers began experimenting with whatever materials they had available. They raided supply trucks and found coils of rough hemp rope, the kind used for a dozen different purposes around army camps. Some men suggested using field telephone wire instead, the black insulated wire that connected command posts to forward positions. Both materials had advantages. The rope was stronger and more reliable, but it was also lighter in color and might be visible against dark road surfaces. The wire was darker and less visible, but it might break under stress. They settled on rope for most applications and began the process of assembly. Each M1A1 anti-tank mine weighed several pounds and had a carrying handle on top. The engineers tied lengths of rope through these handles, securing them with heavy knots. They experimented with spacing and found that placing 4 or 5 mines about 5 feet apart created an effective spread. When they dragged the completed assembly across snow, watching the dark shapes of the mines slide along behind the rope, someone remarked that it looked like a necklace, a chain of dark flowers against white snow. The name Daisy Chain was born from that observation. But as the men practiced deploying their improvised weapon, the full reality of what they were proposing began to sink in. This was not like conventional mine warfare, where you laid your traps and withdrew to safety. In many cases, the soldiers had to stay close to the road to pull the mines across at the right moment, although the exact distance varied depending on cover and terrain, close enough to see the faces of German tank commanders looking out from their turrets. That soldier would have to grip the end of the rope and wait, perfectly still, while a 45-ton Panther tank approached at speed. The ground would shake. The air would fill with the smell of diesel exhaust and hot metal. The noise would be overwhelming, a mechanical roar that drowned out thought itself. And in that moment, with every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to get away from the approaching monster of steel, that soldier would have to maintain his grip on the rope and wait for the precise instant when the tank was directly in front of him. Too early, and the mines would slide across the road before the tank reached them, allowing the driver to brake or swerve. Too late, and the tank would pass by, leaving the soldier exposed with German infantry following close behind. One engineer, whose name has not been preserved in the historical record, reportedly described the realization this way: "This isn't laying a trap. This is a duel. We're asking a man to face down a tank and win a game of chicken." The psychological weight of this tactic was enormous. These were not elite combat troops trained for close quarters fighting with enemy armor. These were construction workers, men who had joined the army engineers to build things, not to engage in personal combat with the most powerful tanks on Earth. Yet they had no choice. The frozen ground had eliminated every other option. If they did nothing, Piper's column would roll past them unopposed, cross the Meuse River, and potentially change the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. The daisy chain was desperate, dangerous, and completely unprecedented. But it was all they had. The fog that morning was thick enough to muffle sound and reduce visibility to mere yards. Near the roads leading toward Stavelot, we can imagine a sergeant from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion taking cover behind a damaged stone wall, because different American units were trying to slow Piper's advance in that area, his hands wrapped around a hemp rope that disappeared into the snow-covered ditch beside the road. His name has been lost to history, but we can imagine his state of mind in those moments. His hands were numb from the cold, despite his gloves. His breath came in short, shallow gasps that he tried to control, knowing that heavy breathing would fog his vision and make noise that might carry to the enemy. Around him, engineers in the area used several improvised obstacles, and it is possible that daisy chains were among the tools they relied on to slow the German advance. The first warning was auditory rather than visual. Through the thick fog came the sound that veterans of the Battle of the Bulge would never forget: the distinctive high-pitched whine of German Maybach engines, combined with the bone-rattling crunch of steel tracks on frozen asphalt. The sound grew louder, taking on a rhythm that matched the sergeant's racing heartbeat. He could not see the tanks yet, but he could feel them, the way you feel thunder in your chest before you consciously register the sound. Then, emerging from the fog like a prehistoric predator, came the lead Panther. At 45 tons, it was smaller than the King Tigers that followed somewhere behind in the column, but to a man hiding 20 yards away with nothing but a rope for protection, it was enormous. The long barrel of the 75mm gun swept slowly from side to side as the commander searched for threats. The sloped armor of the hull caught what little light penetrated the fog, giving the machine an almost liquid appearance as it moved. The Panther was beautiful in the way that apex predators are beautiful, perfectly designed for its lethal purpose. Flanking the tank came German infantry, their eyes scanning the tree line and buildings on either side of the road. They moved with the practiced caution of veterans who had learned that ambushes could come from anywhere. Ahead of everyone walked the Panzer pioneers, the combat engineers responsible for finding mines. They carried their mine detectors, sweeping the equipment methodically across the road surface, watching the needles that would betray the presence of buried metal. German pioneers often used mine detectors to check the road surface, but improvised devices like daisy chains could be difficult to spot, and it is possible that such methods were not part of their usual training, not part of any scenario they had trained to counter. They saw the road ahead, smooth and white with unbroken snow, and they signaled back to the tank commander with confidence. The road was clear. The Panther's driver shifted gears, the engine roared, and the tank lurched forward, picking up speed now that the way seemed safe. The American sergeant watched it come. 25 yards away, 20 yards. The ground began to shake, a vibration that traveled up through his knees and into his chest. 15 yards. He could see individual details now, scratches in the paint, mud frozen to the tracks, the face of the tank commander visible for just a moment before he ducked back inside the turret. 10 yards. The sergeant's training, everything he had learned about the daisy chain in those frantic days of experimentation, narrowed down to this single moment. Wait for the optimal instant. Not when the tank's front is in front of you, but when the center of mass, the vulnerable tracks and drive wheels, align with the hidden mines. The timing had to be perfect. 5 yards. The sergeant screamed something, later he would not remember what, and yanked the rope with every ounce of strength in his body. What happened next occurred in the span of heartbeats, but would be remembered in slow motion by everyone who witnessed it. A dark line suddenly appeared sliding across the icy road surface. 4 anti-tank mines strung together on hemp rope, emerging from the ditch like a serpent striking. They slithered directly into the path of the onrushing Panther, covering the distance in less than a second. The German driver saw them. There were reports later that he attempted to brake. But you cannot stop 45 tons of steel moving at speed on ice. The laws of physics are merciless. Anti-tank mines were capable of breaking a Panther's tracks, and many vehicles in the Ardennes were disabled in this way, so it is possible to imagine a mine blast stopping a leading tank on the narrow road, the toothed wheel that engaged with the tracks to propel the tank forward. The massive Panther lurched violently to the right as one track went slack and the other continued to pull. The tank skidded sideways on the icy road, its 45 tons completely out of control. Metal screamed against asphalt. The tank came to rest at an angle across the narrow road, its useless tracks hanging in broken loops, its gun pointing harmlessly at the forest. Inside, the crew was dazed, their ears ringing from the confined space explosion, their bodies bruised from being thrown against metal surfaces. Outside, German infantry scattered, some seeking cover, others raising weapons to search for the Americans they knew must be nearby. But the real damage was already done, and it had nothing to do with the disabled Panther or its crew. The road through the Ardennes at that point was a narrow corridor, hemmed in by steep banks on both sides. The terrain made it impossible for vehicles to leave the road and bypass obstacles. Behind the crippled Panther, stretching back through the fog for miles, came the rest of Kampfgruppe Piper. More Panthers, King Tigers, half-tracks carrying infantry, fuel trucks loaded with precious gasoline, ammunition carriers. A disabled tank on a narrow road could slow a German column, but Kampfgruppe Piper continued to push forward after heavy fighting, and their real delays came later when bridges were destroyed and fuel ran out. The immediate German reaction was confusion. How could they have hit a mine when the pioneers had swept the road and found nothing? Officers climbed out of their vehicles to assess the situation, and the explosion surprised the German officers because it did not look like a normal buried mine, and they were unsure how it had been placed so close to the tank's tracks. The mine had not been buried in the road. The explosion pattern and damage were wrong for that. It had detonated on the surface, directly under the tank's tracks, at the precise moment when the vehicle was most vulnerable. But how? Where had it come from? It took hours to clear that first disabled Panther, hours during which Joachim Piper watched his carefully calculated timeline disintegrate, split the Allied armies, seize crossings before reinforcements could arrive. Every hour spent stationary was an hour lost forever, and time was perhaps the most precious resource Kampfgruppe Piper possessed. But time was not the only resource bleeding away during these forced halts. The King Tigers and Panthers in Piper's column were marvels of German engineering, but they were also fuel-hungry monsters. A King Tiger could consume hundreds of gallons of gasoline just traveling 100 miles under optimal conditions. The tanks used a great deal of fuel during movement, and they also burned some gasoline while idling to keep the engines warm in the cold weather. But the real problem was the limited supply available for the advance, and the crews inside needed warmth to avoid freezing to death in the sub-zero temperatures. Every hour that Kampfgruppe Piper sat motionless, engines rumbling, was an hour of fuel burned with zero forward progress. Piper's fuel situation was already precarious. The German offensive had been planned around capturing American fuel depots. The Wehrmacht knew it lacked the gasoline reserves for an extended operation. Every gallon wasted sitting idle was a gallon that could not be used to reach objectives. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. But perhaps worse than the physical delays was the psychological toll the daisy chains began to extract from the German forces. After the second and third incidents, different locations, different times, always with the same shocking result of mines appearing from nowhere, paranoia began spreading through the column like a contagious disease. Engineers would sweep a road section and declare it clear, but now tank commanders hesitated. What if there were more of these invisible traps? Every pile of snow beside the road became suspect. Every piece of debris might hide a rope. Every shadow could conceal an American soldier waiting to drag death across their path. The American engineers, recognizing that they had gotten inside the German decision-making process, deliberately escalated the psychological warfare. American engineers sometimes used simple tricks, such as stretching ropes across the road, to slow German units, although these actions were improvised and were not part of a formal tactic with a special name. Ropes or wires stretched across roads with nothing attached, or sometimes with dinner plates or other harmless objects tied on. These decoys cost the Americans nothing but rope and a few minutes of work. They cost the Germans hours. A German pioneer would spot a rope across the road and signal a halt. The entire column would stop. Engineers would move forward cautiously to investigate. They would inspect the rope, trace it to its endpoints, search for mines. Finding nothing, they would eventually signal all clear, and the column would resume movement. But now every rope, every wire, every suspicious marking in the snow demanded investigation. The Germans had no way to distinguish between real daisy chains and harmless decoys except through careful, time-consuming inspection. One report from American positions near Stavelot suggested that some delays may have been caused by harmless objects that looked suspicious in the snow, but there is no confirmed record of a German convoy stopping for hours because of a simple piece of clothesline. And time was the one commodity Joachim Piper could not afford to purchase at any price. The cumulative effect of these delays, both from actual daisy chains and from phantom ones, was catastrophic. It is difficult to measure the exact time lost to mines and false alarms, but these delays added to other problems such as destroyed bridges, heavy traffic, and fuel shortages, all of which slowed Piper's advance. 18 hours during which his fuel reserves dwindled, 18 hours during which American reinforcements moved into position. 18 hours during which the weather, which had been Piper's ally with its fog and clouds, began to change. The weather began to improve later in the battle, and as the skies slowly cleared, American aircraft were able to return to action and attack German units, including parts of Piper's column. The sky turned a clear, cold blue. For the Germans, this weather change was a death sentence. For the American airmen who had been grounded by fog, it was an invitation. The P-47 Thunderbolts came down from their bases like hunting birds spotting prey. The pilots did not need to search for targets. Kampfgruppe Piper, strung out along the narrow roads, unable to move forward or retreat, presented a target-rich environment that fighter-bomber pilots dream about. The Thunderbolts made pass after pass, their rockets and machine guns tearing into trucks, half-tracks, and any vehicle that lacked the heavy armor to resist aerial attack. The Panthers and King Tigers could survive strafing runs, but the softer vehicles that carried fuel and ammunition were devastatingly vulnerable. Joachim Piper, standing beside his command vehicle and watching American aircraft work over his column with impunity, must have realized that the game was over. He had not been defeated by superior American armor, Piper's forces did encounter American tanks at several points, but the narrow roads, destroyed bridges, and fuel shortages often created bigger problems than armoured opposition. He had not been defeated by massed artillery, though that had certainly inflicted losses. Piper's advance failed for many reasons, including destroyed bridges, strong American resistance, difficult terrain, and a severe lack of fuel. And no single factor can fully explain the outcome. The daisy chain had bought time, and time had allowed weather to shift. And weather had brought the American Air Force. Cause and effect, dominoes falling in sequence. By December 24th, Kampfgruppe Piper had fought its way as far as it would ever go. The battle group was surrounded in the village of Gleize, out of fuel, out of time, and out of options. Around 135 German armoured vehicles now sat silent and useless in the area around Gleize, many of them part of the powerful spearhead that had pushed deepest into the American lines. Some had been damaged in combat, many were simply out of gasoline. All were about to be abandoned. The order that Joachim Piper gave that Christmas Eve must have been one of the hardest any commander could issue. Destroy the radios so the enemy cannot use them. Sabotage the gun mechanisms so the weapons cannot be turned against German forces. Prepare to move out, on foot. Leave everything behind. Approximately 800 German soldiers, all that remained of the thousands who had begun the offensive, prepared for the march back to German lines. They wrapped their boots in rags to muffle the sound of their footsteps on frozen snow. They gathered what weapons and ammunition they could carry. They looked one last time at the tanks and vehicles they were abandoning, machines that represented the pinnacle of German military technology, machines they had lived and fought in, machines that now would be left for the Americans like a colossal offering of surrender. In the dead of night, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Piper slipped away into the forest, moving through the darkness like ghosts. Behind them, the 135 armoured vehicles sat in the December cold, frost already forming on their hulls. In the days after Piper's withdrawal, the abandoned vehicles became a striking scene of wrecked armour, and although most were later removed for scrap, a few, like the famous King Tiger at Gleize, were kept as monuments to a failed gamble, as testaments to the law that superior technology does not guarantee victory, as proof that desperation can breed innovations more powerful than any weapon a factory can produce. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the German offensive had already failed. Delays around Stavelot and other road junctions, caused by blown bridges, scattered minefields, and stubborn American resistance, kept Piper far behind the ambitious timetable that German planners had hoped for. Those delays gave American reinforcements time to move into position, allowed the weather to clear so that Allied aircraft could return, and helped drain the limited fuel that his column needed to keep moving. History often celebrates the grand gestures, the atomic bombs that ended wars, the massive tank battles that decided campaigns, the generals whose names appear in textbooks. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, a different kind of victory was won. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, a unit of construction workers and problem solvers, proved that ingenuity could trump technology, that courage at the individual level could have strategic consequences, and that desperation, when combined with creativity, could forge weapons more effective than anything designed in a factory. The daisy chain cost approximately 50 cents per deployment, the price of a length of hemp rope. Their efforts bought precious hours and days, which added to German fuel problems and helped American reinforcements arrive, and these local actions became one small part of the larger story of why Hitler's last great offensive finally failed. The return on investment was incalculable. The tactical principle demonstrated at Stavelot and Gleize has echoed through every conflict since. Asymmetric warfare, the concept that a weaker force can defeat a stronger one through innovation and tactics rather than direct confrontation. became a central focus of military thinking in the decades after World War II. The improvised explosive devices that would challenge modern armies in Iraq and Afghanistan were direct descendants of the daisy chain. Low-cost materials, improvised deployment, and psychological impact that exceeded physical damage. But perhaps the most important legacy of the daisy chain is the lesson it teaches about human adaptability. When the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion discovered that conventional tactics were impossible due to frozen ground, they did not surrender. They did not accept defeat. They asked a simple question: what if we change the rules? And followed that question to its logical, dangerous, and ultimately successful conclusion. The courage required to hold that rope, to wait while a 45-ton tank approached at speed, to maintain discipline while every instinct screamed to run. That courage deserves to be remembered alongside any act of valor in any war. The unknown sergeants and privates who crouched in ditches and pulled ropes at precisely the right moments were not elite special forces operators. They were ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing because circumstances demanded it, and because giving up was not an option they were willing to accept. Germany lost the Battle of the Bulge for many reasons: overextended supply lines, Allied numerical superiority, the return of clear weather that allowed air operations. Engineers' actions around Stavelot, including blown bridges, minefields, and roadblocks, helped buy extra time for the Allies, together with many other fights along Piper's route. Some writers like to imagine that, without these delays, his force might have come closer to the Meuse, but such ideas remain only speculation and cannot be proven from the records. If you had been that sergeant, freezing in a ditch beside a road in Belgium, holding a rope in your numb hands while the ground shook and the roar of a Panther tank filled your ears, would you have held your position? Would you have waited for that perfect, terrifying moment when the timing was right? Would you have pulled the rope and trusted that your improvised weapon would work as planned? It is an easy question to answer in retrospect, sitting in safety. It is an impossible question to answer honestly, unless you have faced similar circumstances. But it is worth asking because it reminds us that history is not made by abstract forces or inevitable trends. Individual actions can matter greatly in war, but they are part of a much larger picture that includes strategy, terrain, and many other decisions made across the battlefield. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion did not wear the medals or receive the recognition that often went to infantry units who fought dramatic battles. They were engineers, support troops, men who built things. But when circumstances demanded it, the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion showed courage and creativity when the situation demanded it, even though their main role was not front-line fighting. They proved that ordinary people, given impossible challenges, can achieve extraordinary results. The daisy chain, made from simple rope and standard anti-tank mines, helped delay German armored units and contributed to stopping parts of Piper's advance, but it did not destroy 135 armored vehicles. Its true impact was measured more in lost time and disrupted movement than in destroyed tanks. Technology was beaten by ingenuity. Doctrine was defeated by improvisation. The most powerful tanks on Earth were stopped by men who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. That is a story worth remembering. That is a legacy worth honoring. If you found this story compelling, if it gave you a new appreciation for the courage and creativity of ordinary soldiers in extraordinary circumstances, please share it. History is full of forgotten heroes whose stories deserve to be told. The men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion deserve to be remembered not just as engineers, but as their actions helped influence the battle in meaningful ways, even though many other units and events also shaped the final outcome. What other stories from World War II would you like to hear? What other examples of improvisation and courage should be brought from the shadows of history into the light? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own family stories of service and sacrifice. Keep the memories alive. The daisy chain played a small but important part in slowing the advance of one of Germany's elite armoured units, although many other factors also contributed to stopping Piper's force. Remember their names, honour their courage, tell their story. If you enjoyed this story of American ingenuity and grit, please hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a briefing on the untold history of warfare. Leave a comment below telling us what other improvised weapons from World War II you want us to cover next. This has been the story of the daisy chain. This has been the story of the daisy chain, a simple improvised weapon that helped delay German armour during the Battle of the Bulge. Subscribe now, and I'll see you on the next front line. On the next front line. On the next front line.